Welcome back to Long History Short, where historians give us the context needed to understand today's global politics. I'm your host, Brian Stoll. As we discussed in our last episode, the AfD, or Alternative for Deutschland, a German nationalist right-wing party, has seen a sharp uptick in popularity. Given Germany's troubled history with right-wing movements, the AfD's rise has alarmed some, and many have characterized the party as far-right and dangerous, while others see them as a legitimate alternative for frustrated voters. In the last episode, we discussed German nationalism primarily in the 19th century. This time, we'll move ahead to the 20th century. Let's get started. Joining me today is Professor Brian van Wyck. Professor van Wyck received his PhD in history from Michigan State University. He teaches at the University of Maryland and has taught courses on German history, European history, and the history of migration. Welcome, Professor van Wyck.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So on the last episode of the show, we discussed the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, but we glided over what Germany was like in between the two wars. For the average German citizen, what was life like during the interwar period?
I guess that really depends on which average German citizen you're looking at. For large numbers of people, this period right after the First World War was a period of really intense political, economic, and social turmoil. So immediately after the war, the war ended, of course, with a German defeat, but the war ended with a revolution. So German soldiers and sailors rose up, refused to participate in a sort of last-ditch suicidal offensive against the British Navy. And German cities were really in chaos as the peace was being negotiated. And as a result of this upheaval, there was a great deal of violence. So there was a great deal of violence, especially in the streets of Berlin, but also in cities like Munich. So Germans experienced this period immediately after the war as one of great instability and violence. And that experience kind of marked the rest of this period in between the two wars. So this period known as the era of the Weimar Republic, so named after the city where the Republic was declared, 1919. So the Weimar Republic was really troubled from its outset. It was born in blood, so to speak, and it suffered several attempted coups. It saw hyperinflation. So at one point in 1923, you had to pay 4.3 trillion Reichsmark. So that's the currency at the time to get a US dollar. So people were paying for a loaf of bread with a wheelbarrow full of virtually worthless currency. For lots of people, this resulted in a feeling of being cheated, a feeling that Germans were being taken advantage of by outside powers. This led to a great deal of resentment. And of course, this resentment really exploded after the Wall Street crash of 1929, which threw Germany into a particularly harsh depression. But with all of that said, Germany in this period was also, the time of the Weimar Republic, was also a tremendously creative society. It was a place where women were increasingly involved in economic life and political life. So women joined the workforce in much greater numbers. About 36% of the workforce in the Weimar Republic was made up of women. It was a period of really intense cultural creativity and experimentation in music and arts and design. I could spend an entire hour just listing the amazing works of creativity that were produced in this period. So Weimar, this period between the wars, was really categorized by both, intense turmoil and intense creativity. You might even say that those were two sides of the same coin.
Interesting. So with all this going on with hyperinflation, violence, but then also this sort of renaissance of art, what were politicians like? How did they respond to everything that was going on? And were they failing in some way, given that Hitler was able to rise up and replace them?
Sure, certainly. There has been a great deal of criticism, understandably, of politicians. And one of the critiques that's been levied at these politicians from historians is that these were not men, almost exclusively men, who were committed to democracy. So there is a term in German called Vernunftrepublikaner, so a Republican of logic, so a Republican of the head, not a Republican of the heart. So German politicians participated in a democratic system, but many of them did so begrudgingly and without embracing the ethos, without embracing democracy as a system that deserved defending and deserved their active and emotional engagement. So the political system in Weimar was also, in some respects, stacked against Weimar politicians. So the electoral system really favored small parties. A party needed only to get 30,000 votes in one of the 60 electoral districts in the country in order to enter parliament, which meant that around 40 different parties were represented in parliament over the course of the Weimar Republic, which meant that forming coalitions was often very, very challenging. Many political parties that were represented in the Weimar parliament, represented the interest of a small number of people. Sometimes, they had very parochial, regional interests, and that made the sort of, cooperation, collaboration, reaching across party lines that is necessary in a parliamentary democracy. That made it difficult, if not impossible. So for many Germans, this resulted in dissatisfaction because governments were constantly collapsing. Few governments lasted very long. So in this, this period from 1919 to 1933, we're talking about 14, 15 years, there were nine elections to parliament and 2 presidential elections, which meant that Germans were dissatisfied with their politicians who seemingly couldn't hold things together long enough to give them stability, which exacerbated the existing political and social divisions in German society at the time.
Sure. So inflation, hyperinflation, polarization, feckless politicians is a recipe for disaster. How did Hitler manage to reach these people who were disaffected and frustrated? What did he do that made his campaigning different?
Certainly. I mean, Hitler did a number of things that were distinctive and different. The Nazi Party was, in some respects, in its election tactics, in its embrace of publicity, in its embrace of, sending propaganda and modern methods of propaganda, the Nazi Party was quite distinctive. But before talking about that, I should probably stress that, of course, the Nazis were not the only party that spoke to disaffected and frustrated people in Germany. So the Communist Party, for example, saw a real, especially at the end of the 1920s, saw a real upsurge in popularity. So Germans democratically voted for anti-democratic parties, especially after the Wall Street crash. But the most distinctive aspect of the Nazi appeal to the average German was their strategy of seeking to appeal to every German, regardless of that German's background or religion or, class. So Germany at this time was a society that was deeply divided along political lines, but also along class, regional, and religious lines. So Protestants tended to vote for specific parties. Catholics had a party that they voted for disproportionately. The working class tended to vote for socialist or communist parties. The Nazis made an effort to appeal not to a specific demographic. Of course, they had certain demographics where they did a little bit better than they did with others. But the Nazis tried to be the most popular political party for working class voters. They ended up being the second or third most popular working class party. They tried to be, the most popular party for the middle class. They ended up being the second most popular middle class party. So they were constantly appealing to all Germans across demographics. And the message that the Nazis were spreading was one, of course, that's focused on negativity and focused on enemies, democratic politicians, and especially Germany's Jewish population for the plight of the German people. But the flip side of that message was that the Nazis preached unity. They preached the idea that the differences between Germans were really immaterial. So it didn't matter if you were a peasant from Bavaria or a banker from Berlin. The most important thing you had in common was that you were a German, and all of these other differences were immaterial. And so the Nazis helped create a feeling of shared identity and community that many Germans in this very divisive period were really hungry to recapture. So they were really hungry for a feeling of unity that many had experienced during the war, and the Nazis offered a facsimile thereof. So they offered this feeling that Germany was united, had a shared purpose, and had an identity that went beyond these various forms of division that were so pronounced in the Weimar political and economic system.
Interesting. Would you say that they pandered to their audience? Like if they were talking to a bunch of bankers, or they were talking to a bunch of Catholics, they were talking to a bunch of working class people, did they shift their message depending on whom they were?
Absolutely, yes. So you can look online and see pamphlets that the Nazi Party prepared for farmers, for example, and then they had a different pamphlet for small shopkeepers, or even like doctors, dentists. And in each of these instances of election material, they are saying quite different things and sometimes contradictory things. The point, however, the overall the overall appeal was not so much based on specific party platforms, a specific set of policies. We're going to do X. We're going to raise taxes on Y. It was based more on this sort of emotional appeal to the population rather than specific policies. So Nazi party officials were very comfortable saying contradictory things to different groups of people, pandering as you said.
Okay. Wow. Great. So Hitler gets into power. He's elected. And he starts moving against the Jews. He starts to change German society in a lot of different ways. How does he convince the German people to back a new war? Or do they need convincing?
Yeah, and this is actually quite surprising. So, I mentioned that some of the appeal of the Nazis for many Germans was that they would bring back this sense of unity and shared purpose that had existed during World War I, at least at the very beginning of World War I. But that didn't mean that Germans on the whole were enthusiastic about another war. Germans remembered World War I as a period of intense suffering. Of course, many lost family members and many experienced widespread shortages during the war as a result of naval blockades. So many Germans were hesitant about the sort of bellicose rhetoric that characterized Hitler's foreign policy immediately after coming to power. So Germans needed some convincing that war would be quick, that war would not, would not involve the sort of suffering on the home front that World War I had involved. And so, Hitler was always a little disappointed at how hard it was to convince the German people to embrace a new war. So, in 1939, when Germany eventually declared war against Poland, Hitler went out onto his balcony, and he thought that he was going to be greeted with this rapturous crowd because he had remembered being part of that rapturous crowd in 1914, celebrating the onset of World War I. He went out to his balcony in Berlin, and not many people were there. He actually had to go back inside rather than give a speech in front of an embarrassingly paltry crowd. Germans were not enthusiastic about the war. They really had to be cajoled, and they really had to be convinced that the war would bring material benefits. The war would improve their lives rather than lead to the sort of suffering, both on a personal level, but also on like an economic and everyday life level that they remembered very well from World War I.
So what kind of benefits did he promise?
Yeah, and this is a quite interesting topic. There are great debates among historians about how to think about the Nazi regime. Was this a regime characterized more by coercion or more by consent? Were people on board because they feared consequences if they expressed any opposition, or were people on board because they received benefits, either material or perhaps even psychological or emotional benefits? But there is really exciting new research that indicates that the average German did receive a great deal from the regime. And when I say the average German, I'm referring, of course, to the average non-Jewish Germans. Jewish Germans lost a great deal. But much of what was lost by Jewish Germans was redistributed to non-Jewish Germans. So large apartments were often taken from Jewish families and then sold at a heavy discount to non-Jewish Germans. Plunder from the countries that the Nazi army occupied, so from Belgium and the Netherlands, Norway, plunder was brought back to the German homeland and distributed among German citizens. So the average German did not experience a great deal of suffering as a result of the war until very late, until the end stages of the war, when aerial bombardment and shortages really started to affect the average German. But in the early years of the Nazi regime, even in the early years of the war, the average German at least perceived that they were better off, which was part of the success, part of the ability of the Nazi regime to bring people on board who might have been, a little skeptical in the beginning, who might not have been National Socialist voters. We have to remember that the average German did not vote for the National Socialists. The National Socialists never won a majority of German votes in a free and fair election. But by the beginning of the war, the average German was, at least tacitly, in support of the regime. And one of the reasons why the average German came around was because the average German saw benefits.
Okay. Growing up, when I used to watch World War II documentaries, you would see these gigantic crowds in front of Hitler, people cheering, shouting, almost crying. They were still enthusiastic about his speeches and whatnot. So there was still a strong contingent of people who were true believers, right?
Absolutely. There were people who came to the National Socialist mindset or ideology from a bunch of different directions. Some people were convinced by, the specific tenets of National Socialist ideology. They read Hitler's book Mein Kampf, although that's a book that's relatively light on ideology. It's also very poorly written. But many Germans came to National Socialism with their heads. Many other Germans came to National Socialism with their hearts. So they saw these large crowds. They saw the sort of ecstasy and fervor that Hitler instilled in other people, and they wanted to be part of it. They wanted that feeling of unity that the Nazis sought to create. Of course, that feeling of unity was, in some respects, illusory. But seeking that feeling certainly did contribute to bringing many Germans into the Nazi fold who, might have voted for socialist parties in 1933, who might have thought Hitler was a loon before 1933. But seeing what the regime actually looked like in practice, seeing the enthusiasm that the regime engendered, seeing the benefits that the regime brought to average Germans, brought many Germans on board who, from inclination and from prior political conviction, didn't seem like natural or logical Nazis.
Okay. We're going to skip, this feels wrong almost, we're going to skip a little bit past the war. So after the war, Germany was carved up and the East was given over to the Soviets, while the West remained liberal and capitalist. How did the cultures of the two halves of Germany diverge?
Gosh, how much time do you have?
I got a lot.
Yeah. So the cultures of the two Germanys certainly diverged a great deal in many respects. A lot of this has to do with the Cold War. So East Germany joined the Eastern Bloc, was affiliated with the Soviet Union. And West Germany was, of course, affiliated with the Western Bloc, so with NATO and especially the United States. In many respects, these two societies became quite different. Both societies diverged economically. They diverged socially. In East Germany, there was a great deal more emphasis placed on class, on the rhetoric of Marx and Lenin. But in many respects, actually, the two Germanys were quite similar. They shared a great deal. They shared a common sense of Germanness. So well into the Cold War, after decades even of separation, Germans did still feel that they had a shared identity, even after decades of being citizens of different states. In even really basic ways, West German soccer fans, for example, if their favorite West German team was eliminated from a European tournament, they would support an East German soccer team. So there was a feeling of kinship that extended across borders, even when these two German states were nominally, at least, at odds and didn't recognize each other. And there was a great deal of overlap in terms of culture. So both of these two states, despite their vastly different political systems, both states looked back on a shared German history. They both appealed to many elements of a shared German culture, and they also shared a great deal in terms of media. So East Germans, people living in the socialist East, watched West German TV. They listened to West German radio. It was very hard for East Germans to not be apprised of what was going on in the West unless you lived in this one little valley where West German television signals could not reach. They called this in German the Valley of the Clueless. So generally speaking, while of course there were great differences, the divergences can sometimes be overstated. So even as politicians avowed the gulf that existed between the capitalist West and the communist East, for average Germans, there was a feeling that they shared kinship across the wall.
And how about in Berlin specifically, East Berlin versus West Berlin? Did everything you just say hold true there as well?
Yes. I would certainly say that East and West Berlin shared a common Berlin identity. However, this was complicated by the fact that West Berlin was not the capital of West Germany. So Bonn, a city in the west near Cologne, the hometown of Beethoven, Bach, was the capital. So West Berlin was an island in some respects, surrounded by the East. which meant that there was something of a siege mentality in West Berlin that inclined people perhaps to be to feel less fraternal toward Germans on the other side of the wall in East Berlin. Because of these sort of recurrent political crises, because of the special place of Berlin as a city that was governed not by West Germany, but by the occupying powers, Berlin became kind of a hub, or it attracted a large number of countercultural activists, leftist students. So people who moved to Berlin precisely because it was this strange sort of exceptional island surrounded on all sides by East Germany. So because large numbers of people moved to West Berlin from other parts of Germany, this like shared sense of Berlin identity was arguably a little attenuated, a little less strong.
So the AfD has been more successful in East Germany, although recently they've made inroads in Western Germany as well. Why might East Germany be more open to anti-establishment, or you might even say radical politics?
That's a great question. And of course, this is one of the questions du jour for German political scientists and for European commentators as a whole. There are a few reasons that have been put forward for why the AfD is so successful in the East. One has to do with the structural economic disadvantages still shape daily life in eastern parts of Germany. So outmigration, the movement of people from the East into the West, was extremely prevalent after unification. As East German industry shuttered, many East German industries were quite inefficient and used out-of-date equipment, often years past its use date. And as a result, when the East German economy was integrated with the West German economy, not enough measures were taken to sort of ease this transition. So many East Germans experienced unification as an abrupt shock. And this resulted in large numbers of young people, especially young and skilled people, university graduates, moving to the West from the East, which resulted in depopulation and left many of the people remaining in the East feeling disaffected, feeling like they had been hard done by, and often living in cities with crumbling infrastructure. This resulted in political disaffection. This resulted in the feeling among East Germans that is still quite prevalent that they are not participating in the system. They are being governed by the system. They are being ruled by West Germans. West Germans make the decisions for them. And every year, East Germans will pay very close attention to the representation of East Germans in the federal parliament and in the federal cabinet. So the current cabinet in Germany has two East German ministers, which is lower than the percentage one would expect based on the population. This all contributes to this feeling that East Germans lost the unification, and that feeling of being hard done by certainly contributes to a politics centered on resentment that the AfD is very successful at turning towards support.
We're going to come back to unification in a moment, but I have a question that came up on the last episode of this podcast, and I wanted to get your take on it too. How did the German people, and specifically people in Western Germany, cope with the evil done during the Holocaust and during the war? And did that lead to a deflated sense of nationalism among many of them?
Certainly. I mean, there are a number of strategies that people used in order to deal with the crimes that had been committed in Germans' names. Many Germans repressed their participation. Many Germans used the opportunity of filling out these denazification forms that the Allies distributed to kind of rewrite their background, and eventually starting to believe that they had been, opponents, or they had not been as Nazified as they actually had been. So repression, lying to others and to oneself, these were common strategies of dealing with lingering feelings of guilt and shame as a result of German complicity in the Holocaust. There were some taboos against overt expressions of nationalism. So many Germans who visit the United States are often struck by things like American children standing to say the Pledge of Allegiance, which seems anathema to Germans. They're struck by, the prevalence of American flags. These are things that are less common in Germany. But these sort of overt expressions of nationalism, while they are less common, Germans still often thought of themselves as Germans. And I think this comes out very clearly when we look at the relationships between ethnic German people, ethnic German citizens of East and West Germany, and non-ethnic German migrants in the period of division and also in the period after division. So even as Germans are uncomfortable articulating a sense of national pride, it was still clear to them what the boundaries of Germanness were and who belonged and who did not. So Germans continued to think in nationalist terms, even if they performed that nationalism perhaps in less overt ways. And I should say that this changed quite a bit with the decades. So in the 1960s, especially the young generation of Germans, many of whom had parents who had been active participants in Nazi crimes, they used that complicity as a cudgel, a way to attack their parents' generation. And this resulted in an interest in the Nazi past and in the complicity of the average German in the Nazi past, but it also resulted in a sort of undifferentiated idea of complicity, an idea that assumed that Germans in 1968, for example, were just as fascist or Nazi as Germans had been in 1945. It assumed that there had been no progress made. So it was, I would say, a shallow understanding of continuity and change after the fall of the Nazi regime. It's really only in the 1980s and 1990s that we see this real boom in memory culture. This is when Holocaust education really enters German schools. This is when concentration camps become important educational sites. It really took a full generation and a half from the end of the Second World War for Germans to focus their attention on the Nazi past rather than repressing it or thinking about it in simplistic terms. But this process of coming to terms with the past was a slow and gradual process, and it looked different for different people.
Is there something we can point to that maybe elicited that change or that shift in perspective where they went from first lying to themselves about it, denying it, doing mental gymnastics to avoid complicity, to then just shifting the blame on the parents because they wanted to basically act like hippies or, just be countercultural, to finally coming to terms? Can we point to anything that would have caused that final shift?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, a few reasons have been put forward for this. In the 1980s, there's actually a really surprising way in which young people, so children, school children at this time, start to have a large effect on memory culture. In Germany, there is a very popular competition that exists across all German schools where school children do history projects, and the best history projects are awarded a prize. And it's something that the average German student has some familiarity with and participates in. So these history competitions in the 1980s gave many young Germans who were often the grandchildren of perpetrators of the Holocaust, gave them an opportunity to explore the interaction of the Nazi past with their the concrete local specificities of their hometown or home city or home village. This sort of generational change was important. Certainly, German unification in 1989, 1990 was very important in changing German self-perception. This created the idea that Germany was becoming a more normal country. So didn't need to worry quite as much about reverting to national socialism. And certainly, I mentioned generations, but there is certainly also an extent to which time had passed. So the generation of perpetrators was beginning to die out. Confronting the past became slightly easier when the generation of Germans who, in many ways, directly complicit in Nazi crimes, was no longer there to push back against against attempts to commemorate or understand or draw attention to their crimes. So the absence of the perpetrator generation certainly did facilitate in some ways the this change in memory culture.
Okay, and that makes sense because it's a lot easier to be sort of morally condemnatory if you're not talking about your grandpa or your grandmother.
Absolutely.
So tell me about reunification of Germany, because we've all seen videos of the Berlin Wall coming down, but after that glittering, optimistic moment, what happened next? Was it a happy marriage? Were there challenges? How did that go?
Yeah, and I would certainly say it was not a happy marriage. There certainly was, a feeling of exultation, immediately as the wall went down. People celebrated, families were reunited. So there was a real, and for some period, lasting feeling of exultation. And many East Germans looked positively at the architects of German unification. So they felt unification had been a good thing, at least initially. And so the Christian Democratic Party, the Christian Democratic Union, which was in charge of West Germany at the time, did tremendously well in the East immediately after unification out of gratitude for the role that it played in unification. However, after that celebration, there was a bit of a hangover. I mentioned the sort of structural disadvantages, the in many ways flawed conversion of the East German state industry to a capitalist system, structural unemployment, outmigration, crumbling infrastructure. All of these contributed to a feeling that East Germans had lost out in national integration and unification. So you will often have East Germans who I know, who I speak to, that refer to themselves as something like, post-colonial subjects, like they were colonized by the West. This wasn't a marriage so much as the West taking over the East, because, a marriage implies a give and take. And from the perspective of these East Germans, there was only give. They gave things up. They didn't get much as a result. And this certainly contributes to the appeal of a party like the AfD to a population that feels hard done by.
So lastly, you're an expert on Turkish immigration to Germany, and stemming the flow of immigration, and particularly Muslim immigration, has been a theme in a lot of the AfD's rhetoric. When did Muslim or Turkish immigration to Germany start, and has there been an uptick in it in recent years?
Certainly, yes. Germany has a long history of Muslim populations dating back centuries. But in recent history, the largest migrant inflow into Germany from a Muslim majority society began in the 1960s. So as a result of the war, Germany had labor shortages, at least in certain industries in certain areas, and recruited workers from Southern European countries, including Turkey, in order to meet those labor shortages. Turkish workers were more likely to stay. Turkey had a large population. The Turkish economy was weaker, and Turkey was more politically volatile than West Germany. So staying in Germany long term was appealing to large numbers of Turkish origin migrants. This was the source of Germany's first large permanent Muslim population. And at this point, this is still a relatively small minority, but it's a relatively small minority that exercises an outsized influence in German political discussions. And so the AfD, their focus tends to be less on the existing Muslim population in Germany, Turkish origin migrants and their descendants. Their focus tends to be more on recent arrivals, especially migrants from Muslim majority societies who arrived in 2015 during the so-called long summer of migration, sometimes called the refugee crisis. So the more than 1 million Syrians who live in Germany at present. The AfD derived a great deal of its success from migration. However, it derived a great deal of its success from exaggerating the problems associated with Muslim migration. Germany is a country of immigration from around the world. Germany hosts the most foreign students of any non-English speaking country in the world. And so Germany has become a destination for migrants from every corner of the globe. But the focus of the AfD has been on Muslim migrants rather than migrants from other locations. The AfD has particularly stigmatized Muslim migrants and has treated Muslim migrants as a cohesive group, a group that's defined by its religion, not by its nationality, by its political or class identity or linguistic identity. So in previous instances of widespread migration to Germany, there wasn't a rise of far-right politics. There were large influxes of migrants into Germany in the 1950s, in the 1960s, in the 1970s, and yet it was really only in the last decade that we've seen a far-right party gain the level of support that the AfD presently enjoys. In the most recent polling, it is by a small margin the second most popular political party, at least when Germans are asked to rank their political preferences before an election. And so this is, in many respects, an unprecedented and new situation for which German history offers some previous precedents, but no direct precedents.
We are just about out of time, but Professor Van Wyck, thank you for your time and your knowledge.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Now you've heard the long history short. Make sure you tune in next time for part 3 of the history of modern Germany.